It was 60 years ago today that a monumental event took place, a monumental event in all of human history, and certainly an event that, when you know Bible prophecy, is nothing short of amazing. Today we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the return of Israel to the land, the birth, the rebirth of the nation of Israel. And my friends, this is a miracle, and we need to understand it. I'm John Nieder. This is the Prophecy edition of Songtime. I must say that if I had the opportunity, I would love to go back and restudy history. When I was young, many of you can relate to this, it was probably the one class where I paid the least attention. But now I find myself fascinated by especially world history as it pertains to the Jews, especially history as we see it revealing the hand of God. And what I'd like to do is I am looking at a book entitled The Timetables of Jewish History, a chronology of the most important people and events in Jewish history. I'd like to highlight a few things from this book in light of the fact that today we in the West, according to our calendar, celebrate the 60th anniversary of the rebirth of Israel. According to the Hebrew calendar, of course, they celebrated beginning the end of last week. But that celebration continues today. We have world leaders who have made their way to Israel to celebrate this epic event. And friends, it's epic not only in terms of human history, but it is mind-boggling in terms of what it means for Bible prophecy. Because Israel is precisely where Israel needs to be in order for God to do exactly what he said he would do in fulfillment of the covenant he made with Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation. But it's fascinating as I look at this book. I look back at, according to the Jewish calendar, the year 30. They would call it the Common Era. It says Pontius Pilate is a Jewish preacher from Galilee, Jesus of Nazareth, crucified in April. Only the late Christian Gospel of John will involve the Pharisees in his trial. Jesus had proclaimed the imminence of the kingdom of God as a relief to the poor in particular. Jesus' followers, calling themselves Nazarenes, regard him as the anointed descendant of King David, or Messiah, foreseen as a redeemer in biblical prophecy. Well, that's accurate to a point. But you notice there's a defensive posture saying only the Gospel of John. Then later, just 10 years later, again, according to this history, a Jewish history, many followers of Jesus are Jews, many of whom, like James, called the brother of Jesus, adhere to the traditional commandments. Saul of Tarsus, who studied with Rabbi Gamaliel, in Jerusalem, begins preaching to Gentiles. It goes on and says this about Saul, who became Paul. In fact, they note that. He begins preaching to Gentiles under the name of Paul that Jesus' death atoned for human sin and that faith in Jesus' divinity redeems without observance of the Torah. New Christians accordingly do not become Jews. In other words, when Paul began to preach to the Gentiles, you can see as they look at this from their perspective and they look back on what took place, that those who then put their faith in Jesus Christ no longer continued to practice ancient Judaism. And so that was the year 40, according to the Jewish calendar. Now, 30 years later, and by the way, this is in fulfillment of Bible prophecy, Jesus said that there would come a time in which every stone of the temple would be torn down, the city of Jerusalem would be destroyed. Jesus predicted this. And here's what we read, the year 70. Titus lays siege to Jerusalem in the spring and struggles to breach its defenses. Initially frustrated, he surrounds the capital with a wall, hoping to starve the defenders. In early Av, that's a Jewish month, or midsummer, Titus takes the Temple Mount and burns down the Jerusalem temple. A month later, the Romans overcome the last Jewish defenders of the upper city. The fall of Jerusalem leads to removal of the Jewish aristocracy, the high priesthood from the Sanhedrin, and then it talks about the changing control as Rome begins to rule. What's fascinating about this book, is that if you continue to read the history of Judaism, what you're going to see as you go through the years, is that rather than talking about Jews who are in Israel, you start to read about Jews who are throughout Europe, Jews who remained in ancient Babylon. And it goes on. In fact, at the year 500 in this book, rather than simply talking about Jewish history, it actually divides it up, that there is a general history of the Jews. There is a column devoted to Jews in Europe, a column devoted to Jews in the Middle East and North Africa, and then a column that discusses Jewish culture. In other words, this graphically demonstrates that the Jews have been dispersed. They've gone every direction imaginable. And no one could ever imagine that after all that they would go through, all the oppression, of course, that led to the Holocaust. When you read the history as you go through this, it's fascinating to see that here is a people that, again, they're not in their land, largely so. Instead, they're all over the globe. And then what we do is we come up to 1948. If time were to allow me, I would love to give you more of the history that led up to what we're celebrating today. May 14th, 1948. Against all odds, here's what we discover. The Jews secure control of Jaffa after several weeks of fighting. Golda Meir, accompanied by Ezra Danin, meets secretly with King Abdullah in Transjordan. She fails to dissuade him from joining the Arab invasion of Palestine to take place upon the departure of the British. David Ben-Gurion convenes the Provisional Council, later to become the Knesset, or Parliament, in the Municipal Museum of Tel Aviv. He declares the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine to be known as the State of Israel. Ben-Gurion is elected prime minister, and Chaim Weizmann is the president. The United States grants full and unconditional de facto recognition to the Provisional Government of Israel, established on May 15th, Israeli time. As the British withdraw, the armies of Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq begin their invasion. Saudi Arabia sends a formation to fight under Egyptian command. Yemen considers itself at war with Israel, but sends no contingents. The Israelis repulse the Syrian invasion of the Jordan Valley, and in fact, miraculously, the Jews stood their ground and became a nation on this date. A photo that captures it all. It's a photo of David Ben-Gurion there in the Municipal Museum of Tel Aviv, proclaiming the establishment of the State of Israel on May 14th.